The letter was still in her pocket. 3 weeks of traveling, and she hadn't thrown it away. Margaret Colton pressed her palm against the worn fabric, feeling the paper crinkle beneath her finger. The train platform stretched empty before her. The 4:15 to Cedar Falls had left 18 minutes ago. Edward wasn't coming. She knew it the way she knew the weight of the child inside her, heavy, certain, impossible to ignore. The station master had stopped looking in her direction. A fly buzzed near her ear. The late September sun slanted low across her shoulder. A man walked past leading a bay mare. His boots stopped. She didn't look up. "Next train's tomorrow morning," he said. "I know." The silence stretched. She waited for him to leave. He didn't. "I have a cabin," he said. "There's a room. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you've been enjoying these stories, consider subscribing. It helps us keep bringing you more." The wagon seat was harder than the train bench. Margaret gripped the edge as it rattled over a rut, one hand pressed against her belly. "The man Dawson," he'd said. Just Dawson hadn't spoken since they left the station. His hands held the reins loose, but his knuckles showed white in the fading light. The bay mare's hooves kicked up dust that settled on Margaret's skirt in a fine layer. She watched his profile from the corner of her eye. 40, maybe older. Sun-creased skin. A jaw that looked like it had been set in one expression for years. He stared ahead at the road like it might try to escape. 15 minutes more," he said without turning. She nodded, though he wasn't looking. The letter crinkled in her pocket when she shifted her weight, Edward's handwriting the elegant loops, the promises written in ink that was probably dry before she'd finished reading them the first time. She'd memorized every word on the journey west. "I will be waiting. Trust me." The sun dropped below the hills, painting the sky the color of bruised fruit. Dawson's ranch appeared as a dark shape against the dimming horizon. A cabin, a barn, a fence that leaned to the left like a tired man. No other buildings, no other people. Margaret's throat tightened. The wagon creaked to a stop. Dawson climbed down and walked around to her side. But he didn't offer his hand. He stood 3 feet away, waiting. She understood. He wasn't going to touch her unless she asked. Margaret gripped the wagon's edge and lowered herself to the ground. Her ankles ached. The child shifted inside her, pressing against her rib. Dawson picked up her valise, the old leather bag with the brass clasp that had belonged to her mother, and carried it toward the cabin without a word. She followed. Inside, a coal oil lamp sat unlit on a rough wooden table. The smell of coffee and wood smoke hung in the air. 2 chairs, 1 bed visible through a doorway, another door, closed. Dawson set her bag down and pointed to the closed door. "That room," he said. "Lock works from inside." Margaret looked at him. His eyes didn't move from a spot somewhere over her left shoulder. "There's water in the pitcher. Privy's out back. I'll be in the barn." He was gone before she could answer. She stood alone in the cabin. The silence pressed against her ears. Through the window, she watched him disappear into the dark shape of the barn. She was 5 miles from the nearest town with a stranger who hadn't asked her name. Margaret woke before dawn. Gray light seeped through the window. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The smell was wrong. The silence was too deep. Then the weight in her belly shifted, and everything came back. Copper Creek, the empty platform, the man with the cabin. She pushed herself upright, her back aching from the unfamiliar mattress. The room was small but clean. A wooden dresser with a chipped mirror, a wash basin with a blue stripe around the rim, A hook on the back of the door where her shawl hung. Her fingers found the letter in her pocket. Still there. Still real. She left it where it was. The cabin was empty when she opened her door. A fire crackled in the stove. Someone had lit it recently. A pot of coffee sat on the edge, steam curling from the spout. On the table, a plate, covered with a cloth napkin. She lifted the corner. Biscuits. Cold, but soft. Margaret stood in the middle of the room and listened. Wind against the walls. The home. A horse somewhere outside. Nothing else. She walked to the window. Dawson was by the barn, hauling water from a well. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, despite the morning chill. He didn't look toward the cabin. Margaret ate 2 biscuits standing at the window. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her tongue, the dry crumble. The faint taste of salt. The baby pressed against her stomach, and she put a hand there, feeling the hard curve beneath her palm. On her 3rd day, she started cleaning. Dawson hadn't asked her to, but the cabin needed it. Dust in the corners, cobwebs near the ceiling, a sticky film on the windowsill. She found a broom behind the stove and swept until her shoulders burned. By afternoon, her feet had swollen. She sat on the porch step, watching the sun move across the empty land. No trees nearby, no neighbors, just brown grass stretching to the hill. She heard his boots before she saw him. Dawson stopped at the edge of the porch. His eyes moved to the swept floor, visible through the open door, then back to her face. He said nothing. "I found the broom," she said. He nodded once. The silence stretched between them. Margaret wanted to fill it with explanations, with gratitude, with something that made sense of this arrangement. But the words stuck in her throat. Dawson walked past her into the cabin. She heard him moving inside, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a cup. That evening, she was organizing the small dresser in her room, her few clothes mixed with what must have been left behind. A woman's blouse, too small for her now, a pair of stockings with a hole in the toe, and underneath everything, folded in careful squares, a child's dress, blue cotton, faded at the seams, small enough to fit a girl of 3 or 4. Margaret's hands stopped moving. She lifted the dress carefully. The fabric was soft from washing. A small white button was missing from the collar. She could see the thread where it had been. She looked at the empty room. The bed that was too big for one person. The hook by the door that could hold 2 coats. She put the dress back exactly where she found it. That night, Dawson came inside for supper. Margaret had made beans with the salt pork she found in the larder. They ate in silence. The scrape of forks, the only sound. When he finished, he stood and carried his plate to the basin. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, like he'd forgotten how to use it. "You're welcome." He paused at the door. His back was to her. "There's a lock," he said again. "Use it." She watched him cross the yard to the barn. The lamp in her hand threw long shadows across the floor. That night she lay awake listening to the wind. Through the thin wall, she could hear nothing from the main room, no footsteps, no coughing, no sign that anyone else existed in this empty place. But someone had lived here once. Someone who wore blue dresses and needed small buttons. She pressed her hand against her belly. The baby kicked once, twice, then settled. Margaret stared at the ceiling. In the drawer, beneath her borrowed clothes, the child's dress waited in the dark. 2 weeks passed like water wearing down stone slow, smoothing everything into new shapes. Margaret learned the rhythm of the ranch. Dawson rose before dawn. Coffee at first light. He worked until the sun was high, then came back for whatever she'd cooked. Afternoons, he mended fences or tended the horses. Evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the darkness swallow the land. She watched him from the window more than she should. The chickens became her domain. Dawson had pointed to the coop on her fourth morning, eggs need collecting, and she'd taken over without being asked. The hens pecked at her shoes and clucked in irritation, but they gave her something to do with her hands. One morning she was scattering feed when she heard him laugh. Not a full laugh, just a short sound, almost a cough. She turned. Dawson stood by the fence, and for a moment, just a flash, his face changed. The lines around his eyes softened. Then he looked away, and the moment was gone. "There's a new one," he said, pointing. "Found her 2 days ago, half dead on the road." Margaret looked at the chicken he meant. Smaller than the others, with mottled brown feathers. She was eating frantically, like she expected the food to disappear. "She's hungry?" Margaret said. "She'll catch up." They stood there, 3 feet apart, watching a chicken eat. The absurdity of it hit her. Suddenly she was 7 months pregnant, standing in the middle of nowhere with a man she didn't know, discussing poultry. A sound escaped her throat. Not quite a laugh. More like air releasing. Dawson looked at her. Something flickered in his expression. Confusion. Maybe, or curiosity. She turned back to the feed bucket before he could ask. The next afternoon, a wagon appeared on the road. Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw the dust rising. Her hands stopped moving. No one had come to the ranch since she'd arrived. The wagon pulled up to the house, and an old woman climbed down with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for 60 years. White hair pulled back under a bonnet. A face like crumpled paper, but eyes sharp as broken glass. "Well," the woman said, looking Margaret up and down. "Eli didn't mention company." Eli. His first name. Margaret hadn't known it until now. "Martha Reed," the woman said, not offering her hand. "I live 5 miles that way, closest thing to a neighbor you've got." Margaret wiped her palms on her apron. "Margaret Colton." Martha's eyes dropped to Margaret's belly, then rose again. Her expression didn't change. "I brought bread," she said. "Men who live alone don't know how to bake worth a lick." She walked past Margaret into the cabin like she owned it. Margaret followed, her heart beating fast. Inside, Martha set the bread on the table and looked around. Her eyes moved across the swept floor, the clean windows, the curtains that Margaret had washed and rehung. She said. That was all. Just Dawson appeared in the doorway. His eyes went to Martha, then to Margaret, then back. "Martha." "Eli." She pointed at Margaret without looking. "You could have told me." "Nothing to tell." Martha made a sound that might have been a laugh or a snort. "Nothing to tell. A woman shows up at your place, belly out to here, and there's nothing to tell." Margaret's face burned. She opened her mouth to explain, to defend, but Dawson spoke first. She needed a place to stay. Uh-huh. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Martha looked between them, her eyes sharp and calculating. Then she shrugged. "Well," she said, "I'll be back next week. Try not to scare her off before then. Eli." She was gone before Margaret could respond. Dawson stood in the doorway, watching the wagon disappear down the road. His shoulders were tight. "She'll tell everyone," he said finally. Margaret's stomach dropped. "I know." He turned to look at her. For the first time, their eyes met fully. "I don't care what they say," he said. Then he walked out to the barn, leaving her standing alone with a loaf of bread and a question she couldn't answer. Did she care? The letter in her pocket felt heavier than before. The baby wouldn't let her sleep. Margaret lay on her side, one hand pressed against the spot where a small foot kept pushing. Midnight. Maybe later. The wind had died down, and the silence outside was so complete it seemed to hum. She gave up and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floorboards creaked under her weight. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and opened the door. The main room was dark, except for a thin line of moonlight through the window. She was reaching for the water pitcher when she saw him. Eli sat on the porch step, visible through the open door. His back was to her, shoulders hunched, head bowed. He wasn't moving. Margaret hesitated. Her hand hovered over the pitcher. She should go back to her room. Whatever sat on him in the dark was none of her business. She was a guest here, barely that. A stranger he'd picked up from a train platform. Her feet carried her to the doorway anyway. The porch boards announced her presence. Eli's head turned slightly, then faced forward again. She sat down 3 feet away from him. The wood was cold through her nightgown. Neither of them spoke. The moon hung low over the hills, casting long shadows across the empty land. Somewhere far away, a coyote called. Another answered. The sound faded into nothing. "Couldn't sleep," she said finally. "Me neither." His voice was rough. Not from disuse this time, from something else. Something heavier. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. The October air bit at her ankle. "The baby kicks," she said. "Worse at night." Eli nodded but didn't respond. His hands hung between his knees, fingers laced together. She noticed for the first time how large his knuckles were. How scarred. The silence stretched. But it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers anymore. It was something else, the quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill the space. "I found a dress," Margaret said. The words came out before she could stop them. "In the drawer? A child's dress?" Eli's hands tightened. She waited. The coyotes had gone quiet. Even the wind held still. "Sarah," he said. The name came out cracked, like wood splitting. "My daughter." Margaret didn't move. "She would have been 6 this year." Would have been. The words sat between them. "And her mother?" Margaret asked. "She shouldn't." She knew she shouldn't. But the question was already in the air. "Rebecca?" Another crack. "She died having her." "Sarah lasted 3 more years. Fever took her." Margaret's hand found the curve of her belly. The baby had stopped kicking. "I couldn't save them," he said. His voice was flat now, emptied out. "Either of them." She thought of Edward's letter in her pocket, the promises he'd written so carefully, the way he'd looked at her the last time, already pulling away, already calculating. "The man who was supposed to meet me," she said. "Edward Harrington? His family has money. Old money. They call it call." Eli didn't turn, but she could feel him listening. "He promised we'd marry, that he'd take care of everything." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then his family found out. About the baby. About me. What did they say? That I was too old, that the child would be a stain on their name." Her voice stayed even. She'd used up her tears on the train. "He sent a letter instead of coming himself." "But you kept it." Margaret's hand went to her pocket. The paper crinkled under her fingers. "I don't know why." They sat in silence. The moon moved an inch across the sky. The cold crept deeper into Margaret's bones, but she didn't stand. "Do you want to keep it?" Eli asked. "The baby. I mean, The question should have offended her. Instead, it landed like a key turning in a lock. "This child is mine," she said. "The only thing I have that's mine. Yes, I want to keep it." Eli nodded slowly. His shoulders dropped half an inch. "Then you will—" It wasn't a promise. It wasn't comfort. It was just a statement, simple and solid. Margaret looked at him. Really looked. The lines around his eyes, the gray starting at his temples, the way he held himself like a man carrying something heavy he'd forgotten how to put down. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it. Someone who wanted something. Everyone wants something. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her. In the moonlight, his eyes were dark and unreadable. "I wanted to be left alone," he said. "I had it planned out. Finish the fence, fix the barn roof. Wait. Wait for what?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Margaret understood. She'd seen that look before in her own mirror, in the weeks after Edward's letter. The look of someone who had stopped expecting anything from tomorrow. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Sarah. About Rebecca. I know." They sat there until the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. Eli stood. His knees cracked. "Coffee," he said. Margaret nodded and followed him inside. Neither of them mentioned the conversation again. But something had shifted. The space between them was smaller now. Not close, but less empty. That afternoon, Margaret took the letter from her pocket. She held it in her hands, looking at Edward's elegant handwriting. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet, but she would be. The town was smaller than Margaret expected. Or maybe she had just stopped expecting much from places. Eli helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store. His hand was rough and warm, and he let go the moment her feet touched the ground. "I'll be at the feed store," he said. "Take your time." She watched him walk away, his boots raising small clouds of dust. 3 women on the boardwalk stopped their conversation to stare. Margaret felt their eyes like pins on her skin. She lifted her chin and walked into the store. The bell above the door jangled. Inside, the smell of flour and tobacco and something sweet molasses maybe filled her nose. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with canned goods and bolts of fabric, and glass jars of hard candy. A woman behind the counter looked up. Her eyes dropped to Margaret's belly, then rose again. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Help you." "I need fabric," Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "For baby clothes, and thread. White, if you have it." The woman, Mrs. Grady, according to the sign above the register, pointed to the back corner without moving from her spot. Margaret walked past displays of kitchen tools and farming equipment. 2 other customers whispered to each other near the canned vegetables. She didn't look at them. The fabric selection was modest. Calico in faded patterns. Muslin, rough but serviceable. A bolt of soft white cotton that would work for swaddling. She was reaching for it when a voice came from behind her. "You're the one staying with Eli Dawson?" Margaret turned. A young woman stood there, barely 20, with blonde hair escaping from a braid. Her expression was curious, not hostile. "Yes." "I'm Annie." The girl glanced toward the front of the store, then back. "Don't mind Mrs. Grady. She disapproves of everything." "Probably disapproves of sunshine." Margaret's mouth twitched. "I hadn't noticed." Annie grinned. Where are you from back east? Pennsylvania? Long way to come. Annie's eyes flickered to Margaret's belly again, but there was no judgment in them, just interest. Must have been hard, traveling alone. It was... The simple admission surprised her. She hadn't meant to say it. Annie nodded like she understood. Well, if you need anything help with the baby when it comes, or just someone to talk to, I'm at the boarding house on Pine Street. My mother runs it. Before Margaret could respond, an older woman appeared at Annie's elbow. Her face was sharp, her eyes cold. Annie? We're leaving. Annie gave Margaret an apologetic look and followed her mother toward the door. The bell jangled again. And they were gone. Margaret gathered her supplies, the white cotton, thread, a package of pins, and carried them to the counter. Mrs. Grady rang up the purchase without speaking, her movements quick and efficient. That'll be 43 cents. Margaret counted out the coins from the small purse Eli had given her that morning. For anything you need, he'd said, pressing it into her hand. She'd tried to refuse. He'd walked away before she could, outside. The sun was high despite the November chill. Margaret stood on the boardwalk, her package tucked under her arm, and looked down the street. The feed store was 3 buildings away. She could see Eli loading sacks into the wagon, his movements slow and methodical. A group of men stood nearby, watching him. One of them said something, and the others laughed. Eli didn't react. He lifted another sack like he hadn't heard. Margaret started walking. She was halfway there when a woman stepped into her path. Older, well-dressed, with a hat that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. Excuse me. The woman's voice was sharp. You're the one living with Mr. Dawson. Margaret stopped. Yeah, without a chaperone, without any arrangement. The word hung in the air. Margaret understood what the woman was really asking. Mr. Dawson offered me a place to stay, she said carefully. I accepted. How convenient. The woman's eyes swept over Margaret's belly. A woman in your condition, appearing out of nowhere, attaching herself to a widower with property. One might wonder what your intentions are. Margaret's face burned. Her hands tightened on the packet. My intentions, she said quietly, are none of your concern. The woman's mouth opened, but before she could respond, Eli appeared at Margaret's side. Mrs. Patterson. His voice was flat. The woman's expression changed not to friendliness, but to caution. Mr. Dawson. We're leaving. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't have to. His presence beside her said enough. They walked to the wagon in silence. Eli helped her up, his hand steady on her elbow. He climbed in beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away, Margaret looked back. Mrs. Patterson stood on the boardwalk, watching them go. Her face was unreadable. I'm sorry, Margaret said when the town was behind them. For what? For causing trouble. She gestured vaguely. All of this? Eli kept his eyes on the road. You didn't cause anything. They were talking about you. Those men at the feed store? They talk. His shoulders moved slightly. They've been talking since Rebecca died. Nothing. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. The baby shifted, pressing against her rib. Why did you do it? She asked. Why did you stop at that platform? Eli was quiet for a long moment. The wagon wheels creaked. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the packed dirt. I don't know, he said finally. I saw you sitting there, and something... He stopped, started again. You looked like you were waiting for something that wasn't coming. I knew that look. Margaret's throat tightened. I wasn't going to stop, he continued. I told myself to keep walking, but my feet wouldn't move. She looked at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins firm but gentle. I'm glad they didn't, she said. He turned his head slightly. Their eyes met for just a moment. Then he looked back at the road, and they continued home in silence. That night, Margaret sat by the lamp and began cutting fabric for baby clothes. Her hands moved steadily, the scissors making soft, shushing sounds as they sliced through cotton. Eli sat across the room, mending a harness. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was comfortable now, warm. Almost. She was halfway through a small sleeve when she heard the sound. Hoofbeats. Coming fast. Eli's head lifted. He set down the harness and moved to the window. Margaret's scissors stopped. Through the glass, she could see a rider approaching in the darkness. Not from the direction of town. From the east, Eli reached for his coat. Stay here, he said. The door closed behind him, and Margaret was alone with the sound of her own heartbeat and the sudden certainty that whatever was coming would change everything. The rider wasn't Edward. Margaret watched through the window as Eli walked toward the man dismounting in the yard. The stranger wore a dark coat, expensive boots, and a hat that had never seen a day of real work. A lawyer. She knew the type before he opened his mouth. Eli's posture changed, shoulders squaring, feet planted. The two men spoke, voices too low for her to hear. Then the stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Margaret's hand went to her belly. She didn't move when Eli came back inside, didn't speak when he closed the door and stood there. The paper crushed in his fist. They sent someone, she said. Not a question. Harrington's family? Eli's voice was flat. A lawyer named Whitmore. He says they want to negotiate. Negotiate what? Eli unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. Margaret didn't want to read it. She read it anyway. The words swam before her eyes. Custody. Financial settlement. Best interests of the child. They want my baby? Her voice came out hollow, like someone else was speaking. They're offering money. Eli pointed to a number near the bottom. Enough to start over somewhere else. They say the child would be raised properly, given every advantage. Margaret's legs wouldn't hold her. She sat down hard on the nearest chair, the paper still in her hand. They can't. The words came out weak. They can't just take. They can try. Eli's jaw tightened. Whitmore says they'll go to court if you refuse. A woman alone, no husband, no income, no family. They'll argue you can't provide. The room tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. All those weeks on the train, she'd told herself stories. Edward would come around. His family would accept her eventually. The baby would fix everything. Stupid. She'd been so stupid. What did you tell him? She asked. Nothing yet. He's staying in town overnight. Wants an answer by morning. Margaret looked at the paper again. The letterhead was embossed Harrington and Associates, Philadelphia. The same firm that handled Edward's business dealings, his property purchases, his inheritances. They had money. They had lawyers. They had everything. She had a borrowed room in a stranger's cabin and a baby that wouldn't stop kicking. I should go. The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them out loud. Eli's head turned sharply. What, if I leave, go somewhere they can't find me? Where? His voice was harsh now. You're 8 months pregnant. You have no money, no family who'll take you in. I'll figure something out. You'll die. The word hung between them. Margaret's throat closed. I can't let them take my child. Her voice cracked. I can't. Eli moved across the room and crouched in front of her chair. This close. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his stubble, the way his hands hung between his knees. Listen to me. His voice was low and rough. Rebecca died in that room behind you. Sarah died in my arms while I begged for mercy. I couldn't save them. I couldn't do anything. Margaret's eyes burned. But you're here? He looked up at her, and something in his face was different, open, almost desperate. You're here, and I'm not going to watch you disappear like they did. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the certainty in his voice. But she'd believed Edward too. They'll destroy you, she whispered. If you help me, they'll come after your land, your reputation. Let them. You don't mean that. I've lost everything that mattered. His eyes didn't waver. What else can they take? Margaret looked at him. This man she'd known for 6 weeks, who'd given her shelter and asked for nothing, who was offering to fight a battle he couldn't win. Why? The question scraped out of her. Why would you do this for me? Eli was silent for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the lawyer's horse shifted in the yard. Because you asked if I wanted something, he said finally. Everyone wants something, that's what you said. And you're right. I do want something. What? He stood slowly, his knees cracking. I want to stop waiting to die. Margaret's breath caught. Before she could respond, he walked to the door. His hand rested on the latch. There's a way to make this legal, he said without turning around. To give the baby a father the court will recognize. To take away their argument. She understood, The realization moved through her like cold water. You mean marriage? He said the word like it was a business arrangement. Not the kind you were expecting, not promises and forever. Just paper? Protection? Something they can't argue against. Margaret stared at his back. The broad shoulders, the worn shirt, the way he held himself like a man bracing for rejection. You don't have to answer now, he said. Think about it. Think. But Whitmore leaves in the morning, and once he's gone, they'll escalate. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in. He stopped. Margaret stood. Her legs shook, but she stood. She thought of the letter still in her pocket. Edward's elegant handwriting. The promises he never kept. She pulled it out. The paper was soft from being handled so many times, creased and worn at the edges. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the stove and fed it to the fire. The flames licked at the edges. The paper curled, blackened, disappeared. When she turned back, Eli was watching her. Yes, she said. The word was small, barely a sound, but it changed everything. Judge Morrison's office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco. Margaret sat in a wooden chair across from the massive desk, her hands folded over her belly. Eli stood beside her, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. The judge was older than she'd expected, 70 at least, with white hair and spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken more than once. He looked at the paper in front of him, then at Margaret, then at Eli. You understand what you're asking, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Eli's voice was steady. Marriage is a legal contract. Once it's done, it's done. No taking it back because you changed your mind. I understand. Morrison turned to Margaret. His eyes were sharp behind the spectacles, seeing more than she wanted him to see. And you, Miss Colton, you're entering this freely. No one's forcing you. Margaret thought of the lawyer who'd ridden away that morning with nothing but a curt message. The situation has changed. The baby pressing against her ribs. The letter she'd burned. No one's forcing me, she said. Morrison leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. I've known Eli Dawson for 15 years, he said slowly. Watched him bury his wife. Watched him bury his daughter. Watched him close himself off from everyone. Eli's jaw tightened. But he didn't speak. When the drought came 2 summers ago, he helped dig the town well. Didn't ask for payment. Didn't ask for thanks. Morrison's eyes moved to Margaret. He's not a talker, and he's not a charmer, but he's decent, better than most. Margaret's throat felt thick. The Harrington family has money and lawyers? Morrison continued. They'll fight this. They'll argue the marriage is a sham, that you're unfit, that the child deserves better. And what do you think? Margaret asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound book. I think a child deserves parents who want her, he said. And I think lawyers from Philadelphia don't know how we do things out here. He opened the book and picked up a pen. I took the liberty of preparing the license yesterday when Eli came to see me. Everything's in order. He looked at Eli. You ready? Eli nodded once. Eli Dawson, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Eli looked at Margaret. She could see it in his eyes, the fear, the hope, the strange mixture of grief, and something else she couldn't name. I do. Margaret Colton, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? She thought of Edward's letter, the promises he'd written so beautifully, so full of lies. She thought of the platform at Copper Creek, the empty bench, the sound of the train disappearing. She thought of Eli's hand on her elbow, helping her down from the wagon. The coffee he made every morning before she woke. The way he'd said, I want to stop waiting to die. I do. Morrison wrote something in the book, then turned it toward them. Sign here. Both of you. Eli signed first, a simple signature. No flourishes. Margaret took the pen and wrote her name beneath his. The ink was still wet when Morrison blotted it dry. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. He closed the book. Congratulations. That was all. No music, no flowers, no guests. Just 2 signatures in a dusty office that smelled like tobacco. They walked out into the November sun. The street was nearly empty. A few horses tied to posts, a woman sweeping a storefront, a dog sleeping in a patch of dirt. Margaret looked down at her hand. No ring. Wait here, Eli said. She watched him walk across the street to the general store. A few minutes later, he came back with something in his palm. A ring, simple copper, slightly tarnished. It looked like it had been sitting in a display case for years. It's not much, he said. It's enough. He took her left hand carefully, like she might break, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit better than she expected. They stood there in the middle of the street, married, holding hands, with nothing to say and everything to lose. What now? Margaret asked. Now we go home. Home. The words sounded different now. They were halfway to the wagon when a man stepped out from the shadow of the feed store. Whitmore, the lawyer. He walked toward them, his face tight with controlled anger. Mr. Dawson. Miss Colton. He glanced at their joined hands. Or should I say Mrs. Dawson now? Eli's grip on Margaret's hand tightened. We're done here. Whitmore? I'm afraid not. The lawyer smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The Harrington family anticipated this possibility. They've already filed a petition in Philadelphia. The marriage changes nothing. Margaret's stomach dropped. What petition? A claim on the child. Based on blood relation? Whitmore's eyes moved to her belly. Mr. Edward Harrington is the biological father. The family has rights, legal rights, that a hasty frontier marriage won't erase. Get out of our way, Eli said. Certainly. Whitmore stepped aside, still smiling. But you should know Edward himself is coming. He'll be here in 5 days. He wants to speak with Mrs. Dawson personally. He tipped his hat and walked away. Margaret stood frozen, her hand still in Eli's, the copper ring cold against her finger. Edward was coming. After everything, the letter, the lawyers, the threats, he was finally coming to face her himself. And she had no idea what she would say when he did. The pain started 3 days after Whitmore's warning. Margaret woke to a tightening across her belly, not sharp, not yet, but insistent. She lay still, counting the seconds until it passed. Then she pushed herself upright and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her water broke before her feet touched the floor. Eli. Her voice came out too quiet. She tried again. Eli. The door banged open. He stood there in his work clothes, his face white. The baby, she said. It's coming. Eli was out the door before she finished speaking. She heard hooves pounding away, riding to fetch Martha. The next hours blurred into a haze of pain and pressure. Martha arrived with the town midwife, a woman named Clara with steady hands and a calm voice. They pressed Margaret back into the pillows, told her to breathe, to push, to wait. She couldn't wait. Her body had its own plan. The contractions came faster, harder. Margaret gripped the headboard until her knuckles went white. Sweat soaked through her nightgown. Martha's face swam in and out of focus. You're doing fine, Martha said. Almost there, almost there. The words meant nothing. There was only the pain, the pressure, the feeling of being torn apart. I can't. You can. Martha's voice was firm. One more push. Give me one more. Margaret bore down. Something gave. She screamed a sound she didn't recognize as her own, and then, suddenly, release. A thin, high wail filled the room. Margaret collapsed against the pillows, her chest heaving. Clara was holding something, someone wrapped in white cloth. A girl, Clara said. Healthy, strong lungs. She placed the baby in Margaret's arms. Margaret looked down. The infant's face was red and wrinkled, her eyes squeezed shut, her mouth open in protest. Tiny fingers curled and uncurled. Hello, Margaret whispered. The baby's cries softened. Her small hand reached toward Margaret's face. The door opened. Eli stood in the frame, his hat crushed in his hands. He didn't step inside, just stood there, staring. Come in, Margaret said. He moved slowly, like a man walking through deep water. When he reached the bed, he stopped. His eyes were fixed on the baby. A girl, Margaret said. Eli nodded. His throat moved, but no sound came out. Do you want to hold her? He looked at Margaret. Really looked. For the first time since she'd started screaming. Something shifted in his face. Fear, maybe. Or hope. He held out his hands. Margaret placed the baby in his arms. He held her awkwardly at first. Too stiff. Too careful. Then the infant made a small sound, not a cry. just a sigh, and his whole body changed. His shoulders dropped and his breath caught. "She's so small," he said. "They start that way." A sound escaped him, half laugh, half something else. He looked up at Margaret, and his eyes were wet. "What do you want to call her?" Margaret had thought about this for months. Names had drifted through her mind, her mother's name, her grandmother's, names from books she'd read. None had felt right. But now, looking at Eli holding this child that wasn't his blood, but was already his in every way that mattered, she knew. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Eli looked down at the baby. His thumb brushed her cheek, so gently Margaret barely saw him move. "Hope," he repeated. The words sounded different in his voice. Heavier. More real. Martha cleared her throat from the doorway. "There's a rider coming up the road," she said. "Fancy clothes, city horse." Margaret's stomach is early. "I'll handle it," Eli said, handing the baby back to Margaret. "No." She shifted, wincing at the pain. "I need to see him. You just gave birth. I know what I did." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "But this ends now. Today. I won't have him circling. Not around her." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Martha, help her." Edward stared at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders dropped. "I never wanted it to be this way," he said. Neither did I." He looked at Hope one more time. Something moved across his face. Regret. Maybe. Or loss. Then it was gone. "I won't trouble you again," he said. He walked out without looking back. Margaret listened to his footsteps cross the porch, the creak of saddle leather, the hoofbeats fading into the distance. Then she began to shake. Eli was beside her in an instant. He didn't speak, just sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand over hers. Hope stirred against Margaret's chest. Her small mouth opened, closed, opened again. A tiny fist waved in the air. "Is it over?" Margaret asked. "It's over." She leaned into him, her husband. This man she'd known for 2 months. This man who had given her everything. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli's hand tightened on hers. "You don't have to thank me." "I know." She closed her eyes. "But I wanted to." They sat together in the quiet room while the morning light grew stronger. Outside, the first birds of December began to sing. Hope opened her eyes. They were blue, not Edward's blue, but something lighter, something her own. Margaret smiled. And in that moment, in that small cabin on the edge of nowhere, a family took its first breath together. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with a mourning. Perhaps you know what it is to be left behind. To sit with the weight of promises that were never kept. Many of us have stood on our own platforms, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. And perhaps you also know or are still learning that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never expected. The quiet ones, the broken ones, the ones who stopped walking when they could have kept going. It's all right to still carry the old wounds. It's okay if healing doesn't look the way you thought it would. Sometimes it looks like a stranger's hand on a train platform. Sometimes it looks like a copper ring. Sometimes it looks like a baby named Hope. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for part 9 until the end. Thank you for staying in